Well, hello everyone. Everyone is doing their choose your own text assignment, and I usually like to get in on the fun, and so I am going to do one as well. And so the text I chose to do is this one right here by Jeffrey Pfeffer, Dying for a Paycheck, How Modern Management Harms Employee Health and Company Performance and What We Can Do About It. Now, this is not a philosophy book. Okay, I mean, this is a philosophy course. I'm doing essentially a management book. So what's up with that? Well, given the nature of the course, knowledge, responsibility, and society, I thought that looking at a real kind of case study or application of some of the things we've been talking about would be more useful than looking at a philosophical treatise that analyzes one or more of those kind of central concepts. Even though there's plenty of value in doing that, and there are plenty of choices that one might choose from on that. But this one is interesting, it seems to me, partly because just about everyone at some point in life, and perhaps right now, is in a job situation. Perhaps you're a hired employee, perhaps you are in some leadership role of some sort. Perhaps you're a student, in which you are also within a kind of large organization. And so those kind of question of what makes a healthy large organization, I think, is a really interesting one. Now, Jeffrey Pfeffer is a management professor, Stanford Graduate School of Business, as you can see. And he's written a lot of books. He is known as a very kind of data-driven, experiment-driven sort of person, but somebody who is really looking at, I guess, questions that touch on, the kind of lived experience of a lot of people. In other words, a lot of management books you find will be about, let's say, how to be a better leader, or how to, make your company more efficient, or something like that. And that's not his approach. His approach really is about the organization itself, or the structure itself. This book is especially interesting. It's a 2018 book, so it's quite recent. And it's interesting in part because I think he is taking on an issue that a lot of people know about, but and talk to their friends about, but it's hard to put your finger on in terms of talking about it more broadly, and that's what we might call a toxic organization or a toxic workplace. Probably just about everyone has had that experience to some extent or other of working in a place that's really toxic, really not good. Well, what Pfeffer does in this book, I think, is really kind of unpacks some of what that actually means. And I think more importantly, he gives a really robust sort of argument for why it doesn't have to be that way, and why it doesn't have to be that way from an organizational point of view, not simply an individual point of view. All right, although he does deal with individual experience and tells lots of stories, and so forth. And so the book really. I'll give you a sense of the chapters here. Hopefully this comes through. So you can see the kinds of things, let's see, is that clear? I think it's clear. That he's dealing with here. Management decisions in human sustainability, the enormous toll of toxic workplaces, layoffs and economic insecurity, health insurance, health effects of long work hours, two critical elements of a healthy workplace, why people stay in toxic workplaces, and what might and should be different. And so you get a sense from those chapter headings that he's kind of really covering a lot of territory with this. As you read this book, he's covering that territory using some pretty robust, experimental data. He's looking at people's experiences in relation to their workplace and their long-term health effects and things of that nature. And he, what he does not do, and I guess all of us read these books with a view to, our own experience, but he doesn't really talk about universities all that much, which is, I think, unfortunate, because universities, I think it's worth kind of folding universities into these kinds of discussions. One thing that often happens with a university is what I think of as university exceptionalism. which is that universities often think of themselves as organizations fundamentally different from any other organization, and therefore the research that's done on the others really doesn't apply to the university. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think that's a mistake. Universities are not, exceptional in that sense. There are differences, but there are differences between other kinds of organizations as well. If you work in a university, you know some of those differences, right? You know that there is a large kind of contingent workforce that are teaching a lot of classes, right? We call them adjuncts. They are kind of prime examples of some of the stresses that are talked about in this book, right? I mean, Pfeffer talks about the stresses of underemployment, and he kind of really details the kind of health effects that some of those things have, and they're quite striking in some cases. He talks about corporate structures that I think also may have a little bit more flexibility to them than a university often does. And universities are often kind of bounded by their historical structures, also by a struggle between figuring out what things like faculty governance actually means within a university structure. I mean, universities for a long time have regarded their faculty as the kind of brain trust, right? That's where the ideas come from. So in other words, it's not in the upper administration. Administrators are there to administer, right? They're there to run budgets. They're there to, take care of personnel issues. They're there to, address government requirements, all of those sorts of things, and many more, of course. But the actual content of what is taught and the structure of that content, for a long time has been understood as being in the hands of faculty. I mean, they're the ones that are trained within their disciplines, right? So figuring out how that actually works is actually not an easy issue, right? And certainly if you think of a university as a large organization like a corporation, which I think has serious problems with it, but it doesn't act like a corporation in many ways. Having said all of that, the university can be a highly stressful place to work, and there are studies on university experience which show that there are a very high number of employees of universities, both faculty and also staff, that are under a great deal of stress. There are studies that show high rates of illness and things of that nature, high rates of frustration, high turnover sometimes, and so. It would be really interesting to apply a book like this to the setting in which we all find ourselves. And I know most of you are students, some of you also teach. But applying this to a kind of school setting as well, like not a university setting, but a K-12 setting, I think is also interesting. And he doesn't really talk much about that either. I think so much of what he says actually applies to those things. What he does say, one thing I like about this book is that it is not just here are all the problems, but he does have some, if not solutions, at least, here's how it ought to be, okay? And so in this chapter called Two Critical Elements of a Healthy Workplace, he really kind of narrows them down very, very closely. Number one, job control and autonomy, and number two, social support, right? And what's interesting about those two things is that, putting those in place is not the same as providing a bunch of, let's say, perks for your employees or something like that. It's not even about, making their healthcare plan better. And he does have quite a lot to say about healthcare plans in this. But it's really about a certain kind of attitude. How is it possible to run an organization in such a manner, and I call this a virtuous organization, right? I talk about the notion of virtue in some stuff I've written. How is it possible to have a kind of virtuous cycle going on so that things build upon each other rather than undermine each other? A lot of universities have what we might think of as vicious cycles rather than virtuous cycles. In other words, they don't necessarily have, spaces of social support. You might think they do. We have academic departments, for example. We have various offices across campus, but often those feel very isolated in and of themselves. Yeah, you may be in a department, but that doesn't mean that you're working on anything that really very many people in the department will recognize, right? A department is a kind of administrative unit, but when it comes to the actual work that somebody does, it may be very, very different from a lot of other people in the department. I know that's the case for me, although there are some people that come close to mine in my department, but there are a lot of people that are a long way off. And that's fine. I mean, I'm not saying it should be otherwise, but what that means is that it can be hard to find a kind of social network. It's hard at a big university, especially during the COVID crisis when we're all just on, Zoom calls. But even apart from that, it can be hard in a place like Orlando where people are very spread out, and it's hard to kind of get a community that can really do much of anything. It can also be hard in part because of the unique nature of the university. If you think about it, and if you're a tenure track person, and I've already mentioned adjuncts who are in a whole other category, but if you're a tenure track person, that means that you have essentially two possible promotions in your entire career. You're promoted from assistant to associate professor and associate to full professor. And that's it. And many people don't do the second of those. So one promotion in an entire career. Now think about it from an organizational point of view. How do you motivate people under those circumstances? Well, one common way is money. That often doesn't actually happen. There's actually, minimal raises. They might be cost of living, if that, right? So that's nothing really to work for. There may be other kinds of recognition, but those are hard to come by as well. It's very difficult to recognize faculty. What you have instead are often competitions. So there's a teaching award, for example. Well, it's not that you are recognized for your good teaching, it's that you apply for it, provide lots of data for it, and then it's a competition against other people. And some people win that competition and then they get the award, right? So that's not exactly recognition. That's something else. And so it's very difficult under those circumstances to actually find community. Here's the other interesting thing about universities in general, and this is, I think, true whether you're faculty or staff or whatever, and that is the other thing that he mentions, which is autonomy. Okay, universities look like they have loads of autonomy, right? I mean, people mostly leave you alone to do your research, and they don't really check up on your teaching all that much. End of the year you get student evaluations and things like that. But to people within the system, and as I say, it's both faculty and staff quite often, they often don't feel like they have a lot of autonomy. They often feel like they are surveilled, in every possible way, that there are always forms to sign, there are always clearances to get, for everything you do, somebody else has to give it a stamp. So you're really not trusted. I mean, the message is, we don't really trust you, right? You have to jump through somebody else's hoop, and that somebody else needs to tell you, whether you should be doing the thing that you're doing. And so when it comes to autonomy, it feels also very much like you're in competition with other people, with your peers, which makes it hard to build community, but also means that the things that you do are more carefully constrained. And that happens at a weird level, right? I mean, it's not in your job description. It's not even in necessarily what a department chair or what a boss of a particular office or unit tells you must do. But in order to excel, in order to stand apart, in order to, justify your existence, we all are inculcated with the idea that we should be doing more. Sometimes that more is outside of the institution, so it's more service to the discipline, more training, more, this, more that, more something. And it's hard to put a tap or a cap on that more, right? Because it's always a feeling that you are in some sense in competition against everyone else, both inside the institution and in some cases outside as well. this is the interesting structure of the university, and I think Pfeffer is getting at some of those things, even if he doesn't directly talk about them. It's a hard problem to understand how to deal with, right? And it's the reason, that's the reason why it's so often not dealt with. So often what happens instead is that if people are having problems, the problems are regarded as their fault. Okay? Well, you can't cut it. You can't hack it. You're not good enough to be here. And people internalize those explicit or implicit messages. When what's actually happening is a kind of organizational or structural sort of issue that doesn't help anyone, except maybe a very few that manage to learn how to work the system. And so this is true for universities, but it's true for other businesses as well, other organizations as well, I think. Pfeffer does talk about some models that he thinks are quite good. He names some companies that he thinks are really trying to do a good job of making their space into one in which people feel like they have their own autonomy, control over their work, which doesn't just mean, I'm going to go and lie on a beach or whatever. I mean, that's not what this means. What it means is understanding that you were hired as a professional and now you're allowed to be that professional. I guess from my point of view, this book really does give us, an interesting view into other kinds of organizations to think about the, central concepts of the course. I mean, knowledge, responsibility, and society. Well, if the society part is, social organization, that's clearly at the core of this. The ethics part, the responsibility part, really that's what I'm talking about with a virtuous organization, right? What does virtue look like? What does it look like to structure things in such a manner that people can be their best selves? And then the question of knowledge really comes along with that, right? How do we actually know what is affecting us? What stories do we tell to ourselves to say, well, it's not so bad, or, maybe it's really my fault after all, when in fact, if you talk to other people and they were able to be honest, they would actually say, no, actually there's something problematic about the institution itself. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that, not only in my own institution, but in others, with other people, universities, other kinds of organizations, where they come to that moment of realization that the problems they've been having are partly problems of their own ability to cope, but also partly problems of an institution that does not give them the tools to be able to cope. We are all fallible beings, including the people who run these things, run these organizations. And so, I'm not here to condemn, people who aren't doing well. I'm here to ask, what would it look like to do better? What would it look like to actually take people seriously first, right? To realize that the well-being of your workers, your employees, your staff, your faculty, your whatever, actually saves you money in the long run, actually makes your product, whatever that is, better, actually, helps with retention, helps with recruitment, helps with, shareholder interest, bottom lines. I mean, it helps with all of those things, right? It's easy to take your eye off of that and say, well, here's an easy place to cut, right? There's always more people, in the sea. If somebody goes away in a frustration, we'll get somebody else. That's an easy place to cut, so we'll minimize that to maximize other things. And Pfeffer's message is that's exactly the wrong way around. Anyway, that's my little, choose your own text for this session, and it's well worth your time, I think. I think he does a great job and worth looking at.